Welcome to Katorga 12, everyone. Have you ever wanted to explore derelict Soviet facilities? Take a tour back to the 1950s, meet some of the people that worked there and perhaps dismember them? Well, have I got a game for you. Singularity is a 2010 first-person shooter developed by Raven Software and published by The Devil. While at a glance it may seem like one of the many narrative-based FPS games that were made with Unreal Engine 3, Singularity tried to stand out from the rest by having its narrative and gameplay based around time manipulation and its consequences. Was it good? Does it hold up? Let's find out! Join me as we take a walk down the gaming memory lane and revisit Singularity. The game begins when an electromagnetic surge from the uninhabited island of Katorga 12, once held by the Soviet Union, damages an American spy satellite. A group of US Recon Marines, which includes the protagonist, Captain Renko, goes in to investigate. From there on, time shenanigans ensue. I'm gonna do something I don't usually do in my normal review videos and spoil the entirety of the game. Why? I don't know, I kinda feel like talking about it freely. If you would like to know what I think of the game but keep the story unspoiled, skip to the time I show on screen. I very much recommend you do this if you have the tiniest amount of interest in the game, since the plot is a big chunk of what might keep you going and enjoying the experience. Okay? Good. Here we go. So, as Renko and his partner Devlin approach the island, another electromagnetic surge makes their helicopter land the cinematic way and causes them to split up. After the crash, Renko begins to jump between 2010 and 1955, to the date of the incident that caused the abandonment of the facility. While he's there, he saves a man from falling to his death and they both escape. As they make their way to safety, a shadowy figure tries to warn Renko against saving the man. He pays no mind, and after he's done saving the scientist, he returns to a similar but obviously changed present. He makes his way through the abandoned facility trying to reunite with Devlin, all the while encountering the dangerous inhabitants of the island that have been mutated into cannibalistic creatures by a new element called E99. Its discovery and later experimentation serving as the purpose for the facility. Once you join up with Devlin and realize that something is not quite right,
hold up, wait a minute, something ain't right.
You're attacked and eventually captured by Russian troops. It is here that you realize that somehow the scientist you saved, Nikolai Demichev, is now the master of mankind and rules the whole world. At some point after being saved by Renko, Demichev convinced the top dogs in the USSR to grant him a second chance and allow the reconstruction of the facility, which eventually led to him conquering the world thanks to the advancements he discovered. Demichev executes Devlin, but Renko is saved and led to safety by Catherine. She's a member of a resistance group called Mir 12 that fights against Demichev's tyranny. Based on a prophetic journal they found on the island, the members of Mir 12 believe that Renko is the key to putting an end to Demichev's reign by using a gadget known as the Time Manipulation Device, or TMD, developed by another Katorga 12 researcher, Viktor Varasov. After finding the TMD in a hidden vault, Renko travels back in time to try and save Varasov, who had been killed by Demichev for interfering with his research. Renko saves Varasov and returns to the present to find a much older Varasov waiting for him along with Catherine. Together, they determine that they can set history straight by destroying the whole island in the past with a bomb made with E99. Renko and Catherine manage to find such a device, but she is wounded and seemingly disappears just as they retrieve it. The bomb, however, has no charge, and there isn't a sufficient enough source to charge it in 2010, so Renko goes back again to 1955 and charges the bomb, then goes back to the present, travels to the center of the E99 anomaly, goes back again and destroys the island in 1955. Back in the present, Renko finds Demichev holding Varasov at gunpoint. Demichev explains that he yet again managed to rebuild the facility after it was destroyed. Varasov realizes that the moment that changed history was Renko saving Demichev from the fire. The shadowy figure was actually Renko trying to stop himself from doing just that. This part kinda bugs me because from the very beginning, the game is not exactly subtle with the thing that caused the time singularity in the first place. It is very clear that you saving Demichev caused all of this. However, Varasov reacts to it as if it was new information, a twist of sorts that none of you saw coming. I mean, from the moment you realize this, and you will realize this shortly after Demichev shows up and captures you, The rest of the game feels kinda pointless. You will go from level to level doing what Barisov tells you, getting the bomb, charging the bomb, placing the bomb, bombing the bomb, all the while knowing for a fact that none of this is the issue. For all we know at the beginning of the game, this is a perfectly normal 2010 that the characters are inhabiting. All of this is not helped by the fact that Renko is your usual video game silent protagonist. Usually, a silent protagonist serves the purpose of lending a little mystery to the story, as well as making the player somewhat identify better with them. The issue with this game is that you can't help but think that if Renko could talk, he would tell Barisov what he did and what happened, and the game would be half as long. But anyway, Barisov urges Renko to shoot Demichev and go back in time to try and stop himself from saving him in the fire. Demichev, on the other hand, asks Renko to shoot Barisov and join him in his conquest and rule of the planet. You then have a choice. If you shoot Barisov and join Demichev, you get along and rule the world together, until you don't and split up, marking the beginning of a new Cold War between the territories ruled by Demichev and the ones ruled by Renko. Shooting both of them has Renko saying fuck it and allowing the world to burn for a little while, before rising as the leader of a few surviving United States territories and slowly conquering the world himself using the TMD. In the best and most obviously canon ending, you shoot Demichev and go back in time to stop yourself from saving him. Remembering that you didn't care for whatever the shadowy figure had to say, you instead shoot your past self in the head. It all loops back to the beginning of the game, with you and Devlin approaching the island by helicopter. You are now, however, clearly using Russian weapons, the helicopters sport USSR markings, and you spot a huge statue of Barisov equipped with the TMD, clearly implying that he was a sneaky fucker indeed. A post-credits scene shows a wounded Catherine trapped in 1955. With what seems to be her last remaining energies before dying, she writes the first pages of the journal that will eventually lead to the creation of Mir 12. And that's the story. Is it kinda cool? Yes. Does it make any sense? Not really. Making a story about time travel is bound to net you a hefty bag of plot holes, but I've never been concerned with those things, as they rarely interfere with my enjoyment of the narrative. There are, however, a couple of things to note, particularly the game's use of exposition. Obviously, every work of fiction that has its own set of rules and gimmicks needs to, at some point, explain it to whoever is enjoying it. Balancing exposition inside your storytelling is no easy task, and having big chunks of dialogue serve only as setup for your world is never the ideal scenario. There are, however, ways to do it right.
Rapture. City where the artist would not fear the censor, where the scientist would not be bound by petty morality, where the great would not be constrained by the small.
The now gaming classic intro to Bioshock is a great example. Yes, it's a long monologue by one of the characters, explaining everything about the place that the player is about to visit, all the while not being able to move or do anything. On paper, this is a terrible idea, but when it plays out, it makes perfect sense that this is the way newcomers are welcomed to the world of Rapture. The game's level design, sound work, and presentation work in perfect unison, and the result is that this exposition not only makes sense, but you're not really paying attention to the fact that it is an exposition dump at all. It is also retroactively made more logical the more you explore the world and get to know the figure responsible for the creation of everything around you. Contrast that with Singularity, where a character helps you escape elite Russian soldiers and not a minute passes after the shots are being fired when the character in question stops and says, "I'm with this group, this is who we are," and plays a video on a laptop that's just 100% exposition. It's also not the only time the game uses this trick. As a matter of fact, Singularity does not have any characters, but rather exposition machines. There are a couple of NPCs you meet in the game, but save from a couple of audio logs, these have no defining character traits and almost all of their dialogue serves to propel the story forwards and nothing else. The game depends a lot on you having preconceived notions of character archetypes in your head. Going to the previous example, Catherine will tell you she's part of a resistance group. And that's about it. This is everything you will ever know about her. There are things that are safe to assume going off the freedom fighter, rebel, insurgent labels, but she never gets any character moments or dialogue interactions that allow you to see any further than those words. Singularity only really has one character, and that's the island itself. Katorga 12 is a pretty well realized place. The derelict facility is filled with environmental storytelling, notes, audio logs, and even educational films that serve as a witness to the atrocities committed here in the name of progress. From a father leaving one last message before he dies to a seemingly inconspicuous little girl commenting on how school sucks, everything is perfectly set up to make you uncomfortable. These are present throughout the entire game and are the real main characters, so to speak. There are also mysterious graffiti that you can find throughout the game. Some are properly ominous and make you stop for a minute and think about the narrative and where it's all going. The flip side of the graffiti coin are some straight up stupid ones that absolutely cannot be taken seriously. Escape before the ship sinks? I was already doing that, you made me stop to read. Okay, 1955, Demichev, bad. I was gonna say that the story isn't anything to write home about, and it isn't, but to my surprise I actually remembered all of it. I only ever really played through this game once more than 10 years ago, yet all of the narrative bits of the game were there. From character names, to key plot points, to each one of the endings. I think a lot of it has to do with the game having a memorable premise and setting. The time manipulation setup paired with the environmental storytelling are more than enough to keep you going. And the lack of character development doesn't take away from the fact that at least one of the endings has a pretty cool and memorable twist to it. There's also the fact that this game has a couple of very atmospheric sections, which we'll talk about right now. Yeah, you better get used to the word atmospheric. Despite very clearly showing its age almost everywhere you look, Singularity is far from an eyesore. Maybe it's just me, but I always loved the look of Unreal Engine 3 games. For modern standards, you could say the game looks decent enough. During the first half of the game, where the tone is more reminiscent of a survival horror title, the visual package is elevated a bit more thanks to some memorable art direction. I'm no communist, but this statue looks sick as fuck. Or should I say it looks sickle as fuck. The introductory sections in the abandoned facility were by far the most memorable bits in the game, and it's a shame that this tone was not maintained throughout the experience. About halfway through, Singularity stops being an atmospheric horror shooter and becomes, well, just a shooter. The gameplay itself also changes, and we'll talk about the pros and cons of each section in a minute, but I can definitely say that visually the latter half of the game has no pros over the beginning. Your first steps on the island, the search for your companion, and the slow discovery of the terrible things that took place here, paired with the tense atmosphere and suspenseful sound design, are honestly top-notch. The ghostly time apparitions of Katorga 12's inhabitants, along with the evidence of their day-to-day life and leftover audio recordings, paint a bleak picture, easily comparable to BioShock's greatest hits, in the best possible way. After a while though, the environments begin to show a lot less thought to them, becoming very utilitarian corridors and factory yards in which to have your shootouts and action set pieces. Singularity stands out visually when it's trying to be a horror shooter. When it abandons that notion and switches to a regular sci-fi shooter, it's all a little bland. Before replaying the game, I wonder why it was that I remembered the start of it very clearly and many parts afterwards were more of a blur. And now I know, they were just not memorable at all. This, along with a couple gameplay issues, are clear signs that the game could have used a bit more time in the oven. And we'll talk about that a bit more near the end. A lack of development time might also be to blame for the next grievance I have with the game. Nowadays, I think I do a pretty okay job at understanding and speaking English, but there was a time when I was a lot less skilled and depended quite a bit on subtitles. Singularity has no subtitles, at all. Not during cutscenes, not during gameplay. This is pretty bad, not only for people like me whose first language isn't English, but if you go and read the Steam reviews, a couple of them mention having to refund the game because, well, they are deaf, and have literally no way to understand or enjoy the game's narrative. I get that this was 10 years ago and there wasn't as big of a push for accessibility in games as there is today, but every other game I can think of from that time had subtitles. There's really no excuse for this. It also puts a big burden on the sound design and mixing of the game, and while I wouldn't say it was bad, it was also not optimal and I did struggle to hear what the characters were saying sometimes. Going to the audio settings, we can see that they are pretty limited and cannot be used to work around the issue. The soundtrack is okay. I had to listen to it on YouTube after finishing the game, and while I can confirm it was there, it also didn't stand out at any point. It was all mostly ambience music or action ambience music with a little more fanfare. Again, going back to the previous issue, an overly bombastic and epic soundtrack might have made it impossible to understand anything the characters are saying, so who knows. There's also another, less important thing that may have been a consequence of this. This isn't really an issue, more of a nitpick of mine. I don't know what came first, the decision of not having subtitles or the voiceover work, but with your introduction to the island being so atmospheric, the voice acting stands out a bit, and not in a good way. It's a pretty big leap for your suspension of disbelief when you realize that everything is in English. Educational videos you find, the voice recordings, every single NPC, even before some of them know Renko is American, they speak English to him. It's a tiny complaint, but I think that along with subtitles, the game would have greatly benefited from some Russian voice acting, beyond the usual enemy screams during firefights. Aside from all that, I really like the looks of this game. Yes, the latter parts are a bit disappointing, but that's mostly when compared to the beginning. There isn't anything terribly wrong with these areas visually, and it's pretty entertaining to see the things that change when the plot has you going to the past, then back to the future, and so on. Anyway, let's actually play the game. So I'm gonna get the guns and the shooting out of the way first, because it isn't overly complex and doesn't have anything I would call innovative or very interesting. Singularity is a first-person shooter in the vein of, well, every other first-person shooter. The selection of weaponry is mostly standard. You have a revolver, an assault rifle, a shotgun, and a sniper rifle. These are the most basic weapons in the game and also the most valuable to carry around, since like most single-player shooters, you usually end up using the same weapons your enemies do to be able to replenish your ammo from their cold dead hands. This doesn't mean that the game doesn't have what I like to call set-piece weapons, that are cool to feel like a badass for a little while before you run out of ammo. Then there are gimmick weapons, that is, weapons that have a cool idea, but after a while either the shtick gets old or you realize that the weapon isn't very practical. One of them is a rifle that fires a time-bending bullet, allowing you to control its movement while the world is frozen in time. The other is a very inaccurate railgun that fires a delayed explosive. I found myself barely using these last few weapons, mostly because for some reason the game only allows you to carry 2 guns at a time, which heavily restricts your options when it comes to firefights. In the end, the good old rifle-shotgun combo proved to be the optimal way to go. I've talked in previous videos about shooting feedback and how it's very important that firefights feel good in your video game, whether it is because weapons pack a punch and have good sound design, or they make an absolute mess of your enemies, ideally both. Shooting in Singularity is a bit of a mixed bag. On one hand, weapons feel floaty. I don't know of another way to describe the feeling. They just sound and are animated like they lack impact and recoil, with the exception of maybe some of the big guns of the game, that is. On the other hand, damage effects and animations on your enemies are pretty satisfying, if maybe a bit exaggerated sometimes. Combat encounters in this game can be divided into 2 distinct categories, based around the type of enemy you face. There's mutants and there's Russian soldiers. Mutants are the very first enemies you encounter and are only really a threat during the first 30 minutes to an hour of gameplay. They come in 4 different varieties. The most basic ones simply charge at you and smack you about. These guys phase in and out of your timeline and you can't damage them while they're not in it. The ones called reverts are blind and will only attack you if you make noise. The sections involving them are among the more interesting encounters in the game gameplay-wise. Then there's the ticks. These are a pain in the ass and the only ones I died to in my couple of playthroughs. They come at you in a big swarm, exploding when they make contact with you. The game also has a couple of boss fights, as in literally 2 boss fights. What's strange about these 2 encounters is that they do surprisingly little to include the TMD in the mechanics of the fight, with only the first boss even requiring you to use it. In the end, both of them boil down to avoid the attacks while shooting the glowy bits. Both bosses are encountered a few times before you actually fight them. These couple of scenes make for some compelling setup that, unfortunately, like I said, have very little payoff. Firefights against Russian soldiers make up the bulk of the combat encounters in the game. Their AI is questionable. They do the bare minimum to be considered intelligent. They can either shoot you, take cover, or throw a grenade or 2, and that's about it. There's very little variety in their equipment, mostly consisting of regular riflemen and shotgunners, with an elite variant appearing in the final sections of the game. The first few encounters against the Red Army are quite dull, and they play more like an off-brand Call of Duty than anything else. It isn't until you acquire the TMD that things get interesting. The time manipulation device works with a charge bar and can be refilled by reloading it with power cells that you find around the levels. With it, you can age or renew certain items, parts of the levels, and even enemies. The device's impulse ability replaces your basic melee attack and releases a blast of energy that devastates or weakens your foes. The TMD also doubles as a gravity gun, allowing you to pick up objects in the environments and some enemy projectiles. This, along with the aging mechanic, are the bulk of what's needed to solve the few puzzle sections of the game. These are not overly complex and take a few minutes tops to work out, especially since the engine of the game makes it very clear which objects you can use the TMD on. It reminds me of old cartoons, when you could clearly tell that a thing was going to move in some way because it had different coloring. Simple as they are, puzzles offer a nice break from all the shooting and action set pieces. Last, but absolutely not least, is the Deadlock ability, or Sphere of Death as I like to call it. What it does is fire a small ball of energy that expands once it comes into contact with any surface. Things that are caught within the now expanded time globe are frozen in time for some time. I don't think I need to explain to you why this thing trivializes the game to a ridiculous degree. Think of the toughest enemies you've ever had to face in a video game. Now imagine if you could make them freeze on command. Yeah. That isn't to say it's not an incredibly fun ability to use, it's very entertaining. Excuse me gentlemen, you appear to have a severe lack of 545 bullets in your heads. Let me go ahead and fix that for you. Much better. Aw, you were throwing a grenade? The thing is, I disagree with your grenade placement, buddy. I think it looks best here. And then also a nitrogen tank over here, couple of bullets, and voila! Amusing as it is, if you play this game, I recommend you try and use a combination of different tools, because watching enemies just stand there taking damage can get all pretty fast. Speaking of damage, let's talk about the damage you can take. Singularity uses the classic health bar system, with stim packs and medkit pickups to keep you alive. Stim packs heal you when picked up, and medkits can be carried around and used when in need. Along with these items and weapon ammo, scattered around the levels is E99 tech. This is used to purchase upgrades at augmenter stations. Some are unlocked from the start, while others have to be found as blueprints throughout your playthrough before they can be applied. Weapon upgrade kits can also be found, which can be used at weapon lockers to, well, do I really need to spell it out? Like the guns themselves, weapon upgrades are fairly standard and boil down to improvements to magazine capacity, reload time and damage. Weapon lockers also allow you to change your equipped weapons. The game is somewhat replayable since you don't find enough E99 tech or weapon upgrade points to unlock everything in a single playthrough. That is, in theory. In practice, the TMD and hero upgrades are very unbalanced, and it's pretty clear what the best course of action is when it comes to spending your E99. Do you want to heal damage and recharge E99 energy whenever you kill an enemy, or would you prefer holding your breath a little longer while underwater? Stuff like that. If a bunch of the things I just talked about sound like they wouldn't fit well with the overall tone established by the first few hours of the game, it is because, well, they don't. Like I mentioned before, Singularity appears to have conflicting ideas regarding the type of game it wants to be. At the start of the game, it would appear to be a sort of atmospheric horror shooter, with little resources, tense enemy encounters, visually disturbing environments, and even a few jump scares. I fucking hate jump scares, but I must admit they work quite well here. Fast forward a few hours and you will find yourself in the middle of Call of Duty style set pieces, on-rail shooting galleries, and destroying everyone with your awesome time powers. Time powers that are at the same time overpowered and somehow also not used to their full potential. If you think about it, the only real gameplay effect that doesn't feel like a bit of a gimmick is the time sphere of death. Using the TMD on enemies only either ages them into dust or turns them into that guy from RoboCop. Imagine how cool it would be if this was like a process you could stop at any time and go forwards or backwards. Imagine turning an enemy into an old man, or a baby. Crazy firefight and suddenly there's a baby there. The point I'm probably failing to get across now is that it's easy to see that this game could have used more time to fully develop this central gameplay mechanic. Whether it's in the middle of a firefight or a puzzle or narrative sections, it all comes across as overly simplistic and limited. But why? Well, what if I told you that it's kind of a miracle that the game exists at all? Apparently, a couple of years into the development of Singularity, a VP from Activision visited the offices of Raven Software to take a look at the project. It was apparently in pretty bad shape. Half of the levels wouldn't even run on the PlayStation 3, several of them didn't fit the Xbox 360's memory, and even high-end PCs couldn't maintain a stable frame rate during some of the combat sequences. The game was apparently cancelled for a day until Activision gave Raven one last chance to finish and release the game. There was, however, a catch. They only had 10 months to do so.
You what?
That isn't 10 months for the game to go gold and be finished. 10 months to see it on storefronts and in gamers' living rooms. Accounting for things like certification, fabrication and distribution, the team only had about 7 months to work on the game. Complete control of the project was handed to the Marvel team, who had just shipped the video game tie-in to X-Men Origins Wolverine. Then, the process of cannibalizing the game began. Everything that the team knew they had absolutely no chance to get working within the deadline was scratched completely. We're talking about massive changes to the story, action set pieces, complex game mechanics, and that's just to name a few things. You can read the whole story in more detail in a Polygon article that came out a few years after the game was released, written by one of the game developers who worked in the project. I'll link it in the description below. Basically, what it all boils down to is that you play this game and you can clearly tell it was rushed. Then, if you do a little bit of digging and realize exactly why and how it was rushed, it's honestly no short of a miracle that it's as good as it is. Wasted potential aside, this game managed to stay in my memory for more than 10 years, as a very fun experience with a cool story and satisfying gameplay. Replaying it now, I can confirm that it isn't all rosy retrospection. This is a pretty good game with solid gameplay and a memorable story that I had a blast re-experiencing, and I very much recommend you do so as well. So, what happened with this game? Well, despite receiving pretty good reviews and being remembered fondly by basically anyone that played it, sales were not great, and Activision ended up laying off dozens of Raven employees, as well as assigning the developer to the perpetual motion machine that is Call of Duty, where they've been ever since. If you ask me, that's a damn shame. As much as I enjoy my annual dose of Call of Duty, Raven Software used to be the makers of great single-player, narrative-driven experiences, and were not afraid to risk development time and money in pursuit of creativity. I'm literally recording the voiceover now, and I just remembered that this game had multiplayer and I haven't said anything about it. Basically, it's dead. Was unable to play it. It was apparently an asymmetric multiplayer mode where a team of players would be the mutants and another team would be human soldiers. If you search for videos of it on YouTube, the comments say that it was pretty good, so apparently it was pretty good. I'm gonna close off with a quote I liked from the Polygon article. Singularity turned out to be a pretty good game. Much better than it had any right to be given the constraints. But it would have never become a game at all were it not for decisive leadership and a team of exceptional developers. It took years to run Singularity to the ground, but only 10 months to make a solid game. That schedule goes a long way to explain the game's flaws, but it also allows for pride in what was released. Thank you very much for watching. Consider liking and subscribing for more of these, game reviews and other stuff. I have to go now. I'm still getting jump scared.